I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. Help me welcome Simmens to the Poetry of Predicament podcast. Herb is a man who is seriously engaged in developing deep adaptation in his own life and in his community. He happens to be the author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future. Help me welcome Simmens. I am very pleased to announce that our guest for today's episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast is a person that I had the pleasure of meeting in person in a recent trip to Greece for the purpose of participating in a deep adaptation workshop that was provided by Jem Bendel and his partner Katie Carr. Turns out that Herb Simmens was one of the other participants in the workshop with me. We got to meet just a little bit before the workshop, and Herb had let me know that he had seen some of these podcast episodes. So I'm very flattered and happy that that happened. And what I got to find out about Herb is that he has gone and created one of the things that I've been more or less whining about for a few years now, and that is that we have no language for this time of collapse of Earth and human systems. You know, from time to time, I can be heard moaning and bemoaning the lack of language for various aspects of the human experience as we look at the unraveling and experience the unraveling of this business as usual human operating system. And because of the way that Jem Bendel and Katie Carr set up the workshop that I was mentioning, they invited various members of the participants to come prepared with something to present if they wanted to. And I'm very thankful that Herb decided to bring some of his thoughts that he's gathered from himself and other authors and so on about the subject of hope, which I think for most of the viewers of this podcast, we're well familiar with how important hope is in almost any conversation about this unraveling. And so, Herb was kind enough to accept my invitation to be on this podcast to speak about each of those things. Your experience, Herb, of the workshop itself, this rather hastily presented or prepared, but very potent presentation on hope in the workshop that you provided. But really, most of all, this formidable creation that you put together, basically a glossary for our times. So, Herb, there's so much I haven't included. I don't know how you might like to be introduced. So I hope you'll start with just introducing yourself in the way that you would like to be known. And we can pursue any of those threads that might interest you at the moment. And the first one for me, if it were my preference that we got to talk about, it would be recalling our time together in Greece and how that may have impacted you, just your reactions to that. But first, Herb, welcome.
Welcome, Dean. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah.
It's an extra special pleasure because of that amazing time that we had together for 7 days in Greece, in this kind of magical land, talking about, as I believe you described, one of the most important conversations that could and needs to happen anywhere and everywhere on this planet. and with a very amazing group of people and very skilled leaders and wonderful food and perfect weather and all the rest of it that went along with it. So I feel so blessed and grateful to have gotten to know you and everyone else and to have participated in that very, I think it's fair to say, incredibly intense experience that stretched me like I hadn't been stretched before in a very positive way, though it didn't always feel positive at the time, because that's what stretching doesn't always feel positive.
Yep.
So again, I'm very grateful for that. And you can, as you know from our time there, my Hebrew name is Chaim, which means life, and so I use it on sort of special occasions, and so I welcome being called Chaim at the retreat, and I welcome you to call me Chaim if you like, or Herb, or any other word that comes to your mind. I'm pretty casual about that. Okay. And I'm looking forward to what I suspect will be a kind of interesting interplay between these various topics and issues that you're bringing up. So,
well, Herb, would you give us just perhaps a couple of minutes on what has you be involved with this, the most important conversation in the history of humanity? What got you into this?
Mm-hmm. Well, the sort of big picture is that I've always, for whatever reason, maybe growing up in the 60s and being inspired by John F. Kennedy about government being a positive force, and always felt a responsibility and a delight to serve in a public policy sort of way. And so most of my career before I retired a few years ago was focused on working in state and local government. I ran the planning office for the state of New Jersey for a decade. And it was an amazing job because basically our mission was to create a plan for the future next 30 years of the state of New Jersey for 8 million people. So I've always been a kind of visionary in terms of how I look at things. And I guess sometimes that's a disadvantage because you don't look down at what's at your feet and you trip, and it, literally or figuratively, and that's happened to me more than once. But then after I retired, and I had peripherally been involved with climate change in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. But then as I was I actually ran a wellness center for a while, and that's one of my other passions is holistic health. And it became clear to me that climate is the only issue that matters in terms of what people are going to look back and think about us, or if they're even there to think about or imagine us hundreds of years from now. And so I decided that's what I wanted to focus on. Yeah. And that was about 4 years ago. And so basically, as a writer, as an activist, as a participant, as a networker, various capacities, I've basically, that's what I've been doing. And I don't know that I've ever been more fulfilled, as distressing and depressing as the issue is. And but it's one of the many sort of ostensible contradictions that climate presents to us. There's so many paradoxes, and we could talk about it. I'm sure you've talked about it. I've heard some of them that you've talked about with other guests. That it's it's a beautiful day and everything is normal right now, and yet the world is going to hell, and people are acting like nothing is wrong, but they know it is. And yet, how do we express that? 100 different things where we have to sort of hold opposing perspectives at the same time or at similar times. Yep. And so therefore, when people ask me about my book, for example, and I say it was so much fun to write, and then I immediately censor myself and I say, oh, did I say fun? I'm sorry. I mean, I'm not really sorry, but I feel guilty saying I had fun writing something to do with climate change. Yeah. And yet that's again, sort of all the time. I don't know if that happens with you, but it's just kind of, that's where kind of a sort of perspective where you're looking up from the sky at yourself, when you have the kind of observer, kind of Buddhist perspective, and you say to yourself, isn't that interesting? I just said it was fun,
Yeah.
or whatever it may be. Anyway, I'm babbling on, having great fun doing that. But anyway, I'll stop there.
So to just pull on that thread a little bit more, you were just talking about the kind of the irony or the contrast that those of us who are collapse aware, we need to oftentimes really dance on eggshells with other people, given that the vast majority of people that I think you and I both have in our greater circles that we touch in with to some degree, the vast majority of folks are not actively engaged in a collapse aware conversation in their life. At best, they're willfully ignorant and just taking in a small amount of the information that I sometimes call the sober data in our world, taking in a small amount and basically then just shedding it and getting on with life. And what that means, as far as I can tell in the many interactions that I have, is that which a person ignores, if I try to ignore something that is absolutely going on in the world, something that is so in the world, the more I try to repress it or ignore it or suppress it, the more it'll come around in kind of twisted psychological ways. It'll have my presence in the world be odd or compressed, or give me more or less a binary choice in my life of either I'm engaged and I'm not worried about a thing, or I'm deeply depressed and I'm anxious. You know, it tends to be kind of an unfortunate, compressed reality set of choices about how reality can show up. I'm kind of inching toward the next piece I wanted to talk about, which is within that, if we could just start to go for some terms, and eventually we'll get to the glossary, but the term I'd like to start with is hope. So if a person is in that kind of compressed state, mostly just in willful ignorance and trying to ignore or dismiss as much as possible what's going on in the world, they'll have a particular brand of hope. This is actually a question that I'll ask people to kind of quickly assess where are they on the continuum of being present and being able to engage in what's so in the world. And if so, the vast majority of people who answer my question of how would you define hope, they don't say exactly these words, but it always seems to come down to something like this. Gee, I hope the experts come up with solutions to these pesky problems so we can get back to business and life as usual. Again, I rarely have heard those words specifically, but it always seems to come down to that at this kind of average response level. So let me just start there, because I know you didn't spend much time there, because most of us were quite a bit beyond that in that spectrum. Does that spark you to say anything, that particular response about hope?
Well, it's interesting because one of the terms that comes to mind that I came up with is techno-hubris, the idea that technology will save us. And though that may not be as explicitly what these folks have said, but that's essentially it. Though another option would be some people believing that somehow we'll all change our behavior tomorrow and turn into saints and give up our vehicles and everything else that's comfortable. But so I don't think most people are not focused on that piece. They are focused on some external black box, if you will.
Yeah.
That will solve the problem, or just the idea that there are people behind the screen, if you will, that are pulling the strings, that know what they're doing, and that will have a plan, but that may not have told us, but I think, and that's a psychological coping mechanism. And I think those of us who have looked at the data and the psychology and the politics and everything more closely and realize how unlikely that is, have to be, as you suggest, very careful of disturbing that sensibility that people have without support. I talk about that in my book. The term, certainly not my term, it was a climate writer 10 years ago, I think, who first came up with it, the oh shit moment.
Yeah.
That basically that each person at some point will realize as deeply in their gut as imaginable how serious and how omnipresent this is, and how catastrophic it is. And that's a moment of kind of shit, panic, freezing.
Yeah.
And, what I say in the book about that moment is it's so important to have people around them or support system,
Yeah.
such as we had in Greece. And we try to build, I'm sure you do, I do in our own personal lives, to support us in those kinds of existential moments of dread, if you will.
Yeah.
But there's a whole range of terms. If I could just glance to my right here, it's hard for me to remember. I came up with over, I think, 300 or 400 terms and words, and I forgot most of them already. So I've written some. I basically, in preparing for this today, I did 3 columns of words. One are the sort of words having to do with some of the physical, geological changes on the planet. A second having to do with the sort of psychological dimension, and the third having to do with our response as citizens, as governments, and so forth.
Beautiful, beautiful.
But just looking at some of the psychological ones, maybe it might be helpful, and certainly interrupt or change if you like, but with no particular order of importance here. I tried first to classify them, and it got too complicated. But so, for example, I have the climochondriac. Essentially a hypochondriac, somebody who sees climate and attributes climate to everything that's wrong with him or her, or everything that's wrong with the world, because it is so pervasive. And in my book, I talk about after I describe that term, I talk about, where's Woody Allen when you need him? Just the fact that, and this gets back to what I said just a moment ago about being really cautious with other people. I think most of us are familiar with the term trigger warnings. I think we'll need climate trigger warnings to basically say, I'm about to say something that you might find very disturbing. I mean, for example, I'm organizing a group of about 6 of my climate colleagues here to talk about deep adaptation in a couple weeks. And I'm trying to figure out how explicit to be in terms of the conclusions that were often reached and so forth. So that sort of, what kind of trigger warning do I give them?
Right.
So also a way of thinking, there's 2 terms that are sort of connected to each other. One is what I call kind of bifocal behavior. Bifocal meaning you're nearsighted and you're farsighted at the same time. Yep. And you need a way to correct for both. That we need to focus on the immediacy of it, but we also need to realize that it's a long-term problem. In fact, it's a forever problem for all practical purposes. And very few problems in life fit both of those categories, at least as aggressively as this one does. And similarly, I came up with pagency for patience and urgency. It's just another way, essentially, to say the same thing, that we need to have basically a sense of pagency in our life. And that goes back to what we said earlier about these various things we need to hold at the same time, these contradictions or apparent contradictions. And it's like becoming this sort of psychic juggler, if you will, going through life with that. And it's something that I think most of us haven't had to do. And we're not taught that. We don't learn it. We don't know how to do it. Maybe I'll speak for myself. I don't. Yeah, and another part of this is, and some of these terms are sort of different ways of getting at the same thing, is what I call sequential alarmism. That basically you see the story of it was 105 degrees in Paris yesterday. and then 3 days from now, you'll read or hear or experience some other alarming statistic or phenomena that occurs. And then there'll be a couple days of quiet, of calm, of you know, the sort of the another, I didn't actually come up with a term, but I was playing around with the idea of the so-called phony war in World War II, where there was a lull in the early stages of World War II for 6 months or 9 months or whatever it was. And we sort of, that's part of the dilemma of climate, is that we have these lulls, and then sequentially we get, you know, we get alarmed and then sort of back down again, partly because the human body can't take constant alarm. I mean, you burn too much adrenaline, too much of all the other stress, cortisol and all the other stress hormones blow us out.
Right. Not to mention the prevailing communication in a controlled, deeply controlled narrative around the world that has us both normalize any number of extreme events and to minimize the apparent impacts, both near and far. I think
yeah, I mean, it's another. Yeah, I was going to say that it's kind of what's sometimes called the ratcheting effect, where basically, in other words, if it's now 104 in Paris, so the next time it goes to 102, there will be no headline that says it set a new record. It becomes, as you say, it becomes normal again.
Yeah.
And you know, there's also because the climate is changing so quickly, that the age that we're at is so critical in terms of how we see things, because you and I and others of our generation or close to our generation truly remember a, you know, sort of normal Holocene climate when we were growing up, and for many years, for at least the first 2/3 of our lives or so. Whereas people that are under 20 or so have never experienced that.
Right.
And that's going to perceive how they respond or not.
Right. That's one of the very few pieces of this glossary that I've been working on. Nothing to compare to the volume of what you've created, but the word that I use for that is a baseline, is in the process of trying to reconnect ourselves in the ways that we've disconnected ourselves from life. In other words, from deeper self, from other people, from Earth. In order to try and reconnect with any of those, we need to start with creating a baseline experience, which is exactly what you were just talking about. If somebody is 20 years old and they hear about the salmon catch, for instance, here in the Northwest where I live, they think, okay, so it's normal to have 600 salmon, and that's the catch. So what's the problem?
Yeah.
The problem is that every element of salmon populations around the world is on a precipice of extinction for a number of reasons. But someone who has no reference for how it was just 20, 30, 40 years ago, not to mention 100 years ago, they have no reference, no baseline with which to compare. And that baseline is missing in even our experience of our own bodies. It's missing in our relationship with each other and with the earth. So I'm curious, you must have kind of explored that dimension of this, like how we relate to all these topics that way. Keep going with you.
Yeah, I mean, there are several words that come to mind in terms that relate to what we're talking about. And again, well, part of the reason I enjoy doing it in the way I work, I'm one of these people that doesn't know a whole lot about anything, I'm a generalist. And I love that I could look at climate psychology and a little on climate economics and see the links between them. So one of the terms I came up with is what I call universal repricing, that even something like the price we pay or the cost of things will no longer be stable. Right. It's not completely stable, but because of all these shocks from on the weather and shipping and storms and migration and all the rest of us. You know, that's one of the things that we take for granted generally. And when in fact we complain, if inflation is 4%, we feel disoriented because we're used to a price that's stable, if you will, relatively speaking.
Yeah.
And in countries that have severe price instability, Zimbabwe or other countries, you know, or Venezuela now, are basket cases in part because of that. And yet, so the term I came up with that there would be universally repricing all the time.
Yeah.
Another term I came up with is, getting to it, adaptation. I mean, we have deep adaptation that Jim coined. The term that I coined is readaptation, because there will be no such thing as adaptation, or at least if it is, it'll be very temporary, for the same reason that the ground is figuratively, or if not literally, shifting underneath us all the time. And we need a whole new psychology of how to navigate that. How to, almost literally in some cases, how do you use a compass? You know, in a storm, it's hard to hold it steady.
Yeah.
And it's just, you know, what's the handhold? Where are the handholds in the world to come? And the handholds will come, I think, largely from our connection with other people.
Yeah.
Our connection, our knowledge of our own self, our faith, and our connection to the natural world.
Yeah.
As much as all those things will change.
Yeah. But I really love what I'm hearing you say about that, because yes, that list that you just said of what the possible handholds are, what can we more or less rely on in a newly adapted approach to life in an unraveling paradigm. The first will come great uncertainty. First will come that sense of the ground disappearing beneath us in various ways, be they, you know, social contracts or constructs, be they the environment, our relationships. There's got to be a lot of unraveling and kind of liquefaction, if you will, before we're driven to something that really is in our core, that you were just describing, that list of what will the handholds or what will the grounding be that we will then rely on or be able to stand in. But first, this ground is gonna go. It's slipping away right now.
Yeah. No, it's so fluid that one of the other terms I came up with is what I call universal climate design, in terms of thinking about everything we design, whether it's an object, a building, a vehicle, clothing, will need to be rethought in terms of what is the climate impact of both, and also how do we make it in a way that can help us, that it can be, to use the term, a handhold, rather than another thing that we have to let go of or can't hold on to.
Yeah.
You know, another thing that strikes me is how does a materialist society like ours, that by and large, for so many people, their first dimension of security is stuff. How do folks like that, and all of us, because I mean, I'm partly a victim of that. I mean, hopefully I work to minimize that influence on me, but it's there. It's there. Have I ever bought something I didn't need? Even yesterday I did. You know, so I'm not immune from it. But I mean, would you think that? I mean, so many people will want to say, I need to get a bigger house, or a house that's further away from the beach, or I'll get 3 cars if 2 of them die, or whatever. In other words, to look for physical, material, superficial things to protect them instead of these other kinds of handholds. And you may find that society splits even more dramatically into folks who rely on physicality and folks who rely upon non-material, spiritual interpersonal, naturalist kinds of um, of of, of handholds.
It's kind of a combination of psycho-spiritual resources and
Mhm.
relational
Yes. Yeah.
resources rather than the material. Yeah,
Yeah.
I hear you. So what else? Take us, you've got an extraordinary sense of humor, Chaim, and
You're
uh,
putting me on the spot. Don't do that.
no, yeah, I'm not going to make you tell a joke or something, but I just know
Oh,
that
good.
there are pieces that you have shared in some of our conversations where you've shared just a little bit, just more of what you've been doing, sharing with us some of the terms you've come up with in this glossary.
Mhm.
And I'd be just curious if you look at the I think you said 3 lists that you've created
Mhm.
for this
Right.
conversation. As you glance down them, are there any of them that just kind of make you grin for how they came about or what they mean for you as you've been putting this together?
Yeah. Well, one of them is one of my favorites is the frozen chicken syndrome, and very briefly, it's a little complicated, but very briefly, it's the idea that um, birds or chickens have often been literally shot out of guns to test the strength of airline windshields, because to help protect them against the kinds of things that sometimes happen. And supposedly, it's probably an urban legend that British Rail wanted to do that with their rail engines as well, and so they borrowed a gun with a chicken or whatever from the United States, and it was shot to the window, and typically it just bounces off, but in this case it shattered the window, and it went right through the engine, and it almost beheaded the person who was the engineer, and they were just trying to figure out what in the world was going on, and they realized that they had forgotten to defrost the chicken. And the moral of the story is that stuff happens, and I use it in the context of a lot of my book is focused on, and I think today you mentioned a next version would probably shift it a bit. It was focused on what we need to do to address climate change and mitigate it, and that certainly wouldn't disappear. And basically, when it's easy to draw up a plan, we need to do X, we need to do Y, we need to do Z, but we need to do them on a scale never before done, and we need to take into account the frozen chicken syndrome, that stuff is always going to go wrong. And you can laugh about it or not. But so anyway, that's one. Another, and it wasn't so much humor, but I'd like to read one briefly. It's a couple of paragraphs that to me sort of gets at the crux of the dilemma we're in and why we're in it. And it's what I call the carbon sirens, Sirens. And it's Ulysses in Homer's The Odyssey was so tempted by the allure of the sirens that he had to order his crew to restrain him from being in contact with them. Today, carbon is our siren, both enticing and addictive. We have yet to find a way to ignore her charms. Can we find our modern version of Ulysses' army to restrain us from continuing to experience the delights of our very own carbon sirens? The survival of Earth depends upon the answer to this question. And that's a part of the theme that runs through many of these terms, has to do with this addictive nature of the world that we have encountered. I'll read one more thing. I did this introductory kind of vision. I won't read the whole thing, but basically at the end of this vision, or the end of basically what I talk about as the introduction in my book, and I say that this, what I call the central climate conundrum, the 3 C's, central climate conundrum, is why we haven't yet mobilized, knowing that we're in the process of destroying our own lives and the lives of virtually every species on the planet. And then I say, maybe the answer to the conundrum is simpler than we think. To paraphrase what former Texas Governor Ann Richards once said about George W. Bush, we in the modern world were born on third base, and yet we thought we had hit a triple. it was our fortuitous, at least until now, discovery of fossil fuels, more than our cleverness, more than our hard work, more than our technology, more than our religion, our economic system, that placed us on third base. And now the planet is in the process of throwing us out while we attempt to steal home.
That's brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you. Yeah. I love, in the middle of what you just shared, you used the word addiction or addicted. And I couldn't agree more. You know, at the center of that question for me is not only the privilege, the unconscious privilege that you were just pointing to, which absolutely, I become critically aware of that privilege. But I also can see, in fact, how I ended up naming the book that I put out, The Impossible Conversation, is I knew as soon as I had vetted the information about how fucked we are, I knew that this was indeed the impossible conversation. And what made it impossible, what made it clear to me that we would never have the core conversation of what it would take to change, to be able to sustain human life, and for that matter, other life on Earth, is that we are so deeply addicted. And ironically, I'm taken back to George W. Bush that you were just mentioning, where he would, you know, he had that now famous speech about how we're addicted to oil.
Yes.
And that I have a feeling, have had a feeling for quite some time that that will be our downfall.
Yeah, I mean, right, it is. I mean, they're just, you know, it gets back to normalizing or just getting to the point where we don't notice what's around us. So how many times have any of us, I'll speak for myself, have I thought about the fact that when I shop for a vehicle, I'm asked about, or I ask about how many horsepower. Is it 200 or 300 or 400? And it's just an abstract term, meaning the more the better, as opposed to visualizing 400 horses taking me to my local 7-Eleven to buy a Slurpee. I mean, and just this absurdity. And how many times have I over the years read auto magazines where I read reviews of cars by auto critics who have basically talked about this car is no good because it only goes from 0 to 60 in 8.6 seconds rather than 6.9 seconds. And I believed it. You know, I thought, you're right. There's something wrong with that car. Yeah. And so, I mean, it's an example of how, you know, the cliche of the fish doesn't know it's in the water.
Yeah. Yeah. Chaim, I'm wondering if you would share with us just a few more of the terms from your book that, given where we are in the conversation, which, you know, feels like there's some way in which we both are sharing a little bit of our kind of our hand in this, our complicity in this mad system that we're living in. And you've been exploring for quite some time some of the irony, some of the contrast, some of the terms you've created to be able to make some sense, at least ironic sense, of where we are. So can you share a few more with us?
Sure. Getting back to sort of part, I mean, yes, we're in this dilemma in part because of the addiction to fossil fuels, but we also have what I call an empathy deficit disorder. And what causes that, how much of that is innate, is for another conversation, I think. But along with, and so the essentially the antidote to that is what I call the need for collective empathy. And I was actually surprised that I didn't see either of those terms currently existing out there. And again, that's, you know, each of these is a book in terms of what it means and how to get there. Let's see what else. one of the things that we're all facing, those of us who are aware of this stuff, as we all become aware, is the concept of, in particular, and I find this true I spend a lot of time, probably too much, on Twitter, and so much of the climate conversation has to do with flying and how evil it's become and all that. And so one of the terms I came up with is very simply a guilt per gallon, and how much my guilt per gallon increases as I get on a plane or think about getting on a plane or so, even though that's the system that's been set up to go somewhere. You know, another thing that I found fascinating, I think a lot of us, and I certainly this was true of me, thought there was something peculiar about the denialism that climate is occurring, and of course it's been so destructive in its impact. And yet, as I started doing research, I found that there's a kind of what I call disaster denialism that's been going on through the centuries. And one example was the San Francisco earthquake. There was not one monument in the San Francisco area to the earthquake. And in Daly City, which was the epicenter, there was a few years ago, there was a discussion of putting a monument, and they turned it down. And all the propaganda and discussion after the earthquake labeled it the San Francisco fire and not the earthquake.
Yep.
Not unlike Jaws, right, in the movie. And so,
right.
And it made me feel a little bit better. I thought, well, maybe it's partly in our DNA. I don't know, to deny something like that. I thought that was kind of fun. Let's see what else we have here. Oh, one of my, I don't know, I guess it's my favorites is, we all know the wonderful environmental climate group, Friends of the Earth. And I thought, well, if the Koch brothers or other, evil opponents of climate were to put together a climate group, what would they call it? They would call it Friends of the Enemies of the Earth.
Right on.
Yeah. And another thing that's not so much humorous, it's really, I think at the heart of the dilemma we're facing is what I call the media omerta, or code of silence, the Italian word omerta, initially related to the Cosa Nostra and all the rest of that, and the mafia. And the fact that the media, until that's changed now this past year, thank goodness, but until this past year, they would measure the number of minutes that the major networks would focus on climate, and it would be in minutes, not in hours or days. It would literally be 138 minutes a whole year. And oftentimes the network that focused on it the most was Fox, and they were talking about the fact that it doesn't exist or it's not important.
Right.
And the need to deal with that. Some others are, one of the things, this gets back to the consequences of deep adaptation. I think there's beginning to be what I call a civilizational preservation movement to preserve the artifacts of our current civilization. I mean, one of them being the seed bank in Sweden, or Norway rather, the Svalbard seed bank, even to the concept of de-extinction, of bringing back species that are extinct, of trying to catalog all the languages that have disappeared from the face of the earth or so. And I think that will speed up more and more as people try to hold on, or at least leave some legacy for whatever it is that follows us in the future or so. In terms of personal behavior, I think you'll see a lot of what I call climate cocooning, that people will be either afraid to go out, or they won't be able to go out. We'll turn inward to our own families, our own communities, our own cocoons, if you will. Climate Netflix, I think will carry the day. In terms of the larger scale, I think we may begin to see what I call seasonal cities. Some cities and locations that will only be able to be inhabited certain times of the year, like parts of the Middle East. They're already reaching the point where the wet bulb temperature is such that if you're outside for any period of time, you will die. I mean, it's sort of, that's it. There's a whole movement you may be familiar with that's called this is not a new term of mine, the planetary hospice movement.
Yes.
Essentially, that tries to use some of the principles of the hospice movement and applying them to our collective self, not on a one-to-one basis, but on some kind of basis.
Yeah, we've had plenty of conversations about that particular topic here on this podcast.
Yeah, yeah. You know, we talk about doing post-mortems, right, of what happened to look at, well, I think we need to start doing ante-mortems, pre-mortems, if you will, of the upcoming extinction or death of our species, or certainly, I prefer to use the word, I don't like to use the word extinction. I think it's too absolute and too final, and doesn't credit human beings enough. But the term I use is simply decimation. I think that's, you know, if you push me to say what's likely to happen, it would be the decimation of Homo sapiens, not necessarily the extinction of them. And you know, maybe one that's a little lighter is I happened to read about an architect who is literally starting to design housing for Mars. So, which of course, given the obsession, the delusional obsession of the Jeff Bezos and the Richard Bransons and people like that, that we can somehow escape Earth. And so I label that a new profession of Marsitect, if you will, and Marsitecture or so. So you'll begin to see, my prediction is you'll begin to see architecture magazines with sections on marketecture there, and maybe Venus texture, though I think that's still a little hot even for Earth.
Yeah.
Anyway, those are some of the others. Here's one, I think, a practical one. I think there'll be, and there needs to be, a whole field of what I call climaceuticals, named after, similar to pharmaceuticals or nutraceuticals, services and products, for example, that clothing that will basically cool you based upon whatever chemical or fabric developments are invented and so forth. And I think you'll see a whole line of climaceuticals that will come out. And then connected to that is what I call planetary prosthetics, if you will. Planetary aids, like a prosthetic device to assist walking or moving or eating or whatever. And we'll begin to see a whole field of that. So I'll stop there. But anyway, there's a bunch of them.
Yeah. I just want to loop back into the middle of that list that you just read, which, thank you for sharing those samples from your book. I particularly wanted to just land for a moment with you on the idea, I've also heard it called pre-traumatic stress syndrome.
Oh, yeah.
The idea of really anticipating what's coming. So anticipatory grief or anticipatory anxiety or depression. And I'm curious, just on a more personal note, if you have anything to say just about your experience of facing this daunting reality, not so much as the author of the book that you're describing to us, but really just in your own experience, in your own considering this future that we're talking about for yourself, and then also considering, how do you talk with people in your life about this stuff? Because it truly is the largest scale predicament humanity's ever had to face. And it can make for some real stress, even in the simplest conversation. So I'm curious, how does that stuff live for you personally?
Well, I remember even as far back as, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago, going out to hike with a friend of mine in the neighboring sort of woods and stream, and basically being upset even then. And just to say, the anticipation that the animals that were there and the plants and all the life that was nourishing me and nourishing the environment, the ecology around, would be gone or changed or degraded, and that I knew it, but couldn't. I mean, I could do something, I could work on it as I do, but I didn't have the power. And anyway, and I remember I would talk with my hiking partners about it, and very knowledgeable, sensitive people, but they had different passions. They just, I mean, their passion was racial reconciliation, or inequality, or, I mean, they're working on great stuff, and I just couldn't get through to them, and stopped. And even today, I think, I don't have my own kids, but almost every time I see a young kid, like when I go to someplace, I have breakfast in a place where their kids are playing, and if I look up from the food I'm eating, and actually just focus on that one kid at random for a moment, and imagine his or her life, and it's almost impossible for me to avoid tears coming down my eyes. I mean, it's just either literally or figuratively, or I'm certainly feeling a wellspring of emotion. And I guess, like most of us, I ration. I guess that's a way to put it. I ration those emotions. I don't allow myself to be in situations where they come up too often. For rightly or wrongly, but I mean, that's sort of some sense of self-preservation, if you will. Maybe a little bit like a health professional does when they're often accused of, doctors, of being too cold to their patients and so forth. They probably didn't start out that way, but it's some mechanism of defense. And so it's sort of again, it's this kind of dance. There's no ultimate answer. There's no, oh, this is how I deal with it. I deal with it one way one day, and another way, and in 2 hours I'll deal with it differently. And like so much else in life, I think it comes down to being as self-aware and as present as possible, so that I can take in what's happening.
Yeah.
And that's always a challenge, even in a perfect world. I mean, another of the terms I have here, it's certainly not a particularly original or clever term, is simply what I call the distraction dilemma. That we live in a society where there are infinite number of distractions. The obvious ones on our phone and on our computers and on TV, all the rest of it. Robert Mueller testifying as you and I are speaking right now, and 100 other things that are going on, or who won the soccer game yesterday. And distraction is healthy to a point. It makes no sense to castigate distraction as an abstract, and yet as a practical matter, it keeps us away from who we are and what we feel, what we need to feel. I don't know if you want to, before you get back on, I have a bunch of terms that describe some of the physical changes that are happening in the world. I can discuss some of those if you want to ask me.
Yeah, let's take another swing at a few of the entries that you created in your book. Herb, what's the name of your book?
Yeah, good question. A Climate Vocabulary of the Future.
All right.
Here's the title there. I don't know if you.
All right. Yeah, I'll be sure to put that information in the show notes as well. What do you got, Herb? You wanted to?
Oh, some more? Sure. So there's so many physical changes happening to the planet, and I thought I'd just mention some of them here, that in terms of terms I've come up with them, or that other people have. There's the concept or the term drunken trees, which refers to the fact that there are many, many thousands of trees now in the Arctic that essentially are on an angle and in danger of falling down because of the permafrost melting. And so they look like they're drunken. And so my entry there talks about the fact that there's no 12-step program for drunken trees. And I go into a whole long thing about that. That's actually one of my favorites in terms of that we need a 12-step program for ourselves, even more than we do for the trees. And then there's some just odd things like and this is becoming a more common, I saw this in the news the other day, something called sunny day flooding. In places like Miami and Fort Lauderdale, and you get up and it's a beautiful day, and yet you're flooded because the sea level rise and the limestone subsurface is leading to water coming up from underneath or so. So it's not that the disconnect between what's happening out there and what we're experiencing is getting greater that way as well. a comparable term is called clean air turbulence, or clear air turbulence rather. And airplanes, where there's much more turbulence now due to the climatic changes or so, even when it's not obvious that there's a storm in the air or so. And airlines have, in fact, I happened to read one thing that was actually pretty frightening. No, I talked to somebody, actually, I think it was right after we departed in Greece, in London, who said a close relative was a senior pilot and was retiring early because he found, and he expects that flying will become increasingly dangerous because of the turbulent climate. There's dark snow, which is basically all the soot that from all over the world that falls on the snow in the Arctic and the Himalayas, and then increases, of course, the melting because the darkness decreases the albedo, and so you have greater intensity of temperature coming in to melt it even more.
And the now famous research project that's been going on for quite some time in Greenland about that very thing.
Yeah. And then there's also watermelon snow. There's a certain kind of algae in the Arctic that is starting to proliferate, and it has a color not unlike watermelon or so. And so it's watermelon snow. There's methane craters. You see these craters in Siberia. They're perhaps the most frightening thing on the face of the earth, as methane is starting to flare up.
I think are they called pingos? I
think so. I think
that,
I think so. Yeah, my term is just methane craters. Then there's something, again, that's not well known as yet, called marine heat waves, where there are parts of the ocean from time to time, this has happened in the Pacific and several other places, that heat up sometimes for weeks at a time as much as 5 to 10 degrees hotter and kill millions, if not billions, uncounted numbers of marine mammals and marine sea life or so. And scientists don't know exactly the mechanism, but they're there. They're, of course, they're ice quakes, and they're direcos and all kinds of things having to do with rain bombs and all the rest of it that are occurring as well.
Sure.
There's zombie bacteria, which is also from permafrost. The permafrost melted in Siberia 3 years ago, and anthrax basically came out, and it led to the death of a whole lot of reindeer and one person, at least one person, and many people getting injured and sick. And that's happening more and more as these, basically these, we're uncovering the past. And the past has some not so nice things in it.
Yeah.
In terms of its impact on our health and otherwise. Another one that I call, and it's a pretty stark term, but I think it's accurate, is what I say is biotic genocide. That essentially, that's what we as human beings are doing to the biota, or all life on the planet. Essentially, it's genocide in the sense that we know we're doing it. Scientists are documenting it. You don't even need to be a scientist. You need to just be a fisherman or observe your local climate or your territory.
Yeah.
And continue to do it. Anyway, there's, let's see if there are any others. What I call carbon junk food, because as carbon increases in the atmosphere, what they're finding, unfortunately, is the nutritional value of many plants is diminishing in zinc and protein and vitamin this and vitamin that.
Yes.
For a variety of reasons. So essentially, we may think we're eating the healthiest fresh food, but it's nowhere near as healthy and as fresh as it was 10 or 20 years ago. And of course, in many cases, that wasn't as healthy and as fresh as it was 50 years before that, when food was grown in a more natural sort of way. Yeah. So these are some of the last one in this area is a more technical one, but it's sort of one of my favorites. And that is, there's a theory of evolution that's called punctuated equilibrium, or I'm sorry, yeah, punctuated equilibrium
Mm-hmm.
that the famous Harvard scientist Stephen Gould came up with, and Niles Eldredge at the Natural History Museum, that basically says evolution goes along pretty evenly, and then all of a sudden it gets punctuated by these speed ups, and then it slows down again. So I came up with the term punctuated disequilibrium.
Mm.
It's basically that, forget about equilibrium. It gets back to our first or earlier discussion about the fact that nothing is stationary anymore. Everything is always in flux. So you have this disequilibrium that gets punctuated periodically by even more intense disequilibrium or so. And again, how do we deal with that? How do we focus on that? How do we understand it? Time will tell.
So Herb, you've spent more time than the vast majority of human beings on the planet really diving into how we look and feel and see
Mm-hmm.
this predicament that we're in. And you've taken the time to go to the next level, which is to assist in an important way in how do we make sense of this. And one of the main things we need to do to make sense of anything is to create a language for that thing. So you've done a tremendous service as far as I can see, and some of it humorous, but most of it just dead on accurate and extraordinarily useful to be able to have a way of describing my experience. It's so important, this. Excuse me. And how we got to meet was going to Greece and engaging in a conversation with about 20 other people and exploring some of the newer ways of couching the conversation, primarily in the overarching term of deep adaptation. And I'm curious if you could just share with us more from a personal perspective, how is your experience of the world we're living in, how is it changing for you? How are you changing? And how is your experience of the world changing as things appear to be intensifying and accelerating?
Mm-hmm.
And especially after a time of really focused looking and feeling and experiencing together, as we all did, how do you notice the changes that you're experiencing?
Well, I think I feel more and more motivated to act even faster and do more, and to step up rather than to step back.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people may choose to step back when confronted with all this sort of stuff. But I guess I feel, partly because, I'm not a youngster myself, so I don't know how much more time I have with it, assuming it's a reasonably stable climate on the planet. And I do feel that I feel like I'm going into two deep, intense places simultaneously. One is this sort of preparation for deep adaptation, learning it, understanding it, feeling it, sharing it, because I think that's so critical. Because if we're not prepared, it will just exacerbate the tragedies that we'll experience in any case. It will magnify them unnecessarily. But also, I haven't yet given up. I was going to use the word hope. But I prefer to use the word possibility than
Mm-hmm.
hope. And that I haven't given up the possibility that there is a combination of technological and political and other actions that can be taken that could significantly reduce the negative consequences of what is happening over the next couple of decades. And so for me, a lot of it is sort of, and I'm sort of scattered now in about 8 or 9 different climate projects that I'm working on. And some of it is kind of like recalibrating. Do I want to spend more time on the adaptation part or more time on the, I don't even like the word mitigation, but I want in the sort of prevention part, or at least preventing the worst from happening. So I guess for me, it's an increase in intensity of living, and thus, but it's also a conscious effort to increase my awareness of the preciousness, and it's a cliche. It's one of the most profound cliches, but it's still a cliche of just living in the moment. Mm-hmm. It's easy to say, and I'm always amused at how little time I actually do that. Like, what happened today? And oh yeah, I did that, and that was an amazing experience. Where did it go? Was I present for that experience? Not entirely. I'm present for this one today, that's for sure. I don't know. That's a kind of disjointed answer, Dean, but I guess that's sort of what comes out of my mouth right now in terms of where I am.
Yeah. Well,
I do want to say, and that I don't. I really, and I've said this a couple times during our retreat, though not often, but to whoever might be watching or listening to this, I do feel that it's not a contradiction to believe in the likely collapse of our civilization, and to also be fighting as hard as possible and as innovatively and as open-mindedly for a package of remedies that may well forestall that collapse, or at least a lot of that collapse, or delay it.
Yeah.
And I don't have any problem, or at least if I have a problem, I put it aside in terms of focusing on both of those things simultaneously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's clear that expanding our capacity to hold paradox mm-hmm. is one of those capacities that has to be built into this thing that we're calling deep adaptation. So Herb, I just would love to just thank you for your work. Mm-hmm. It was an absolute pleasure to be in Greece with you and with that lovely bunch of folks from so many different countries and so on, and especially with Katie and Jem producing a really remarkable course for us all to participate in about deep adaptation. And you were a part of that. You brought us a segment on hope, and we didn't get to touch quite as much as I would have liked today on that. But it made a huge difference for many of us that were able to listen to what you brought to us about hope. And I really just want to say again what I know I've said to you before, that I think it's a tremendous service that you've done for us by starting this really, no kidding, project to create a new language, a way of languaging what we're facing. And I'll, just say it again for folks who are contemplating getting your book. You've got this irrepressible humor that you feather in, from time to time, but you also, get right to it in other of the definitions of others of the terms that you bring to us in your glossary. And so I just really wanted to thank you for that. It's no small thing from my perspective.
Well, thank you, Dean. And for those of you who are watching, I am working on a next version of this, and I welcome any ideas for new words, terms, critiques of what's in the book now or what you've heard today. I'm sure Dean will post my email address, or it's in my book or whatever. So please, it's a collaborative project. It's not intended to be just what I've done. And I want to thank you, Dean. It was such a delight to have have you as a partner there to take our somewhat harrowing 3 or 4 hour bus ride through the mountains of Greece just to get there.
Yeah.
and for the wonderful chronicling that you did of our workshop. And for those watching this, Dean has put together a wonderful, about half hour, is it, or so,
Yeah.
kind of this sort of smorgasbord summary set of interviews with the participants that really was done in a remarkably soothing and important way. And I encourage folks to take a look at that. And thank you, Dean. I miss you. I miss you so much after spending the week there. And it's great to spend the hour with you now.
Yeah, really good for me too. So I predict that this will not be our last time talking, and please keep me posted whenever the next edition of your work comes out. I look forward to that, and any other excuse we can find to spend time together. It's always a pleasure.
Okay.
Well,
hey, my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, brother, and take good care of yourself.
Okay, right. Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.